Hey friends, I'm Evan Phillips, and this is The Firn Line, a podcast about the lives of mountain climbers. This season, we're going back in time to unlock the history of some of North America's most iconic mountains and routes. But in between those deep dive stories, we're going to have some long-form conversations, and that's what we're up to today. But first, a little business. If you enjoy the work I do here on The Firn Line, there's a few ways you can really help out. First, you can become a subscriber over on Patreon, where you can get bonus content, early access to episodes, stickers, merch, and more. To become a Patreon backer, head on over to patreon.com/thefernline or click the link in the show notes. Another way you can help out is by leaving a review over on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And finally, make sure and just tell someone about the show. You know, word of mouth is the best way to promote the Firn Line, and it really is the backbone of the grassroots vibe I'm going for. So make sure and tell a friend. All right, well with that, it's time to settle in and kick back on your couch, camp chair, or your North Cascades crevasse bivvy and settle in for this episode of The Firn Line.
You have this wonderful transition from, these big, deep, big tree forests, ancient forests. You work your way up and maybe it gets brushy, and then you get to these alp slopes and these huge, expansive meadows, maybe with old moraines from the glaciers. And then above that, there'll be the glaciers. And then above that will be ridges and faces going up to rock horns or, dramatic peaks.
Today, we'll get to know Seattle-based author, climber, skier, and historian Lowell Skoog. Lowell's a fixture in the Northwest outdoor scene, and he's been exploring mountains in the Pacific Northwest for over 60 years. In this conversation, we'll talk about Lowell's early years of exploration in the Cascades, some of the folks who've inspired him over the years, as well as his recent book, Written in the Snows. Lowell is an encyclopedia of information when it comes to the Northwest and Cascade Mountains, and you'll be hearing from him more this season. But for now, enjoy this long-form conversation with Lowell Skoog. Like as a kid, as a youngster, like what first got you interested maybe in that geographic area, but also in climbing, skiing, and the outdoors?
Well, I started skiing before I started climbing. Started skiing roughly 60 years ago with my dad at Crystal Mountain, right? Like, I think it was the year after it opened. The first year was kind of a drought. Second year was pretty good. And I tried skiing that year. And so I was a weekend ski instructor in high school and college. Did some full-time ski instructing in college for a while. And got into climbing with some friends, particularly friends of my older brother who had some climbing experience around the time I graduated from the University of Washington. So that was 1978 or so, mid-70s. So yeah, I got into climbing and also into backcountry skiing. I had been, as I mentioned, a weekend ski instructor since the early 70s, but got into backcountry skiing in the late 70s at a time when it wasn't particularly popular. Telemark skiing was the most popular style of backcountry skiing, but I had always been an alpine skier and chose to do what now is called ski mountaineering. And so, yeah, I was pretty enthusiastic. It was all weekend climbing and then the occasional, midsummer vacation from work. And, I kept a journal over that time. And so I actually have records of, when I climbed various things or when I did various ski tours and who I was with and some of the details. And that, I think, is partly responsible for my interest in mountaineering history, because I've kind of tracked my own history and have done a fair amount of reading by people like Fred Beckey and Bob and Ira Spring, who were photographers, and Tom Miller, who was a climber and photographer, who were basically of my parents' age and was inspired by, the images that they produced and the stories that they told. And so I've, kept at it since then.
Yeah. What do you think was like, have you always been a historian, like kind of inside? Do you think why do you think you started keeping journals? What was your interest in the history?
Yeah, I mean, it was really started on a personal basis. My older brother gave me, as a Christmas present, a little book that the Mountaineers used to publish, and it was a book that would sort of structure your notes about a climb you had done or a trip you had done. And I kept those for those early climbings, really from the beginning when I started, bagging peaks and so on. And it's expanded to where now I've got literally thousands of pages of my own history, my own stories of trips I've done and people I've been with. And I guess that maybe naturally leads. I had done a fair amount of reading by, say Fred Becky's books and other early climbers and writers about the Northwest. And so it kind of merged, I guess you would say, with history and recording my own personal events, just for my memories, and then an interest in, gee, what have other people say of my parents' generation? What did they experience? And ultimately, I got involved in trying to record present day history myself for a while, 7 years in the early 2000s. I with a group of other volunteers, I published an online web journal called the Northwest Mountaineering Journal. And it was at a time when the internet, you were getting a lot more people. There were these news groups and things where people could chat about last weekend's trip or argue about issues or whatever it was. And so there was a sudden resurgence in the energy in the outdoor community because of those online forums. Before it was, maybe you went to a club meeting or you just knew a group of friends, but really this linking of the community through online means was a real boost in energy. And so there was a raft of new climbing and skiing activity there in the early 2000s in particular. And coincidentally, around that time, maybe it was happening around the country, and some of the traditional ways of recording that, particularly the American Alpine Journal, was previously sort of a journal of record for really the whole country. And they said, we're going to get overflowed, so they cut down and they said, well, it has to be a pretty big climb, like what in the climbers' term is called a grade 4. If it's not a grade 4, we don't have room. And so there were a lot of interesting climbs and skiing, which the American Alpine Journal back then didn't cover skiing at all. So I, with some of volunteers, we started an online journal called the Northwest Mountaineering Journal that was capturing all of this energy and publishing it just in a web form that it's still available at. I tucked it in on actually under my own website now. It used to have its separate web domain, but rather than pay the bills, I just when we stopped when we stopped working as a team to edit it, I got a new job and was busy, and everyone else was busy, and so we didn't keep it going that way. So there's this record out there that's pretty valuable to have captured some of that information.
What are some of the stories, kind of going back that inspired you as a kid, or who are some of the characters that inspired you? I mean, because, like we all had people, that inspired us, or climbers, like, oh, I want to be like that person. Like kind of particularly in the Northwest, in the Cascades, North Cascades.
Yeah, I think, well, kind of the guy who, stands head and shoulders above everybody is Fred Becky, who was kind of a phenomenon, not just in the Northwest, but throughout North America of climbing stuff. And he was, very literate fellow and was also very interested in history. And so he wrote some history himself. Challenge of the North Cascades, which is an early kind of a memoir, includes a lot of history of what came before. And then he also wrote the Cascade Alpine Guide, the series of 3 volumes that covers the whole Cascade range. So he was a really, seminal kind of person and inspiring. I didn't know Fred well. I met him a few times. Another inspiration of that generation was Bob and Ira Spring, twins, 2 photographers about my parents' age, who published while Fred was writing. The Springs were photo documenting, and they did. Back in the day, they regularly had pictorial articles in a local Seattle Times paper showing these cool trips that they were doing, all black and white pictures, and really well composed, and showing what the local mountains offered. So those were early inspirations for me to both get out and to also be interested in recording, what other people were doing and what I was doing.
Like I know that there's usually like a transition, like when you start skiing, but then all of a sudden you kind of start transferring into climbing. Like, what was that transition like for you? And what were some of the early kind of climbing adventures that really kind of got the bug for you?
I was, a ski instructor and a hiker, a ski instructor in high school, and I did that on the weekends, and then did some hiking and so on in the summer. But really, when I got into college, I you know, met some old friends, of my older brother. And one early trip I did was into the picket range in the North Cascades, which is, well regarded as the most rugged area in the North Cascades, one of the most rugged areas in the lower 48 states. And so, yeah, that experience really got me interested in getting out and seeing more of the country. And one of the things that's interesting was one of the fellows I went with, Gary Brill, who's considerably older than I. He had taken the Mountaineers climbing course. And so, I had some knowledge and basic knowledge about mountaineering. And I actually had never taken a climbing course. And to this day, have never taken a formal climbing course. And I just got books that sort of had technique,
Right.
Mountaineering, Freedom of the Hills, and there are other books that discuss both technical climbing and just, traveling in wilderness. And so, yeah, that was, really interesting to me. And it was always the getting up to a place and seeing, wow, what's over the next valley and what's beyond the next peak. And in the Cascades, oftentimes when you get up, there's this, it's been commented many times, there's this sea of peaks where it's like you can't see the valleys. All you see is sort of these, rugged, pointed waves of mountains that extend to the horizon. And it's very alluring because, say, there'll be a foreground ridge and you can only see the top of the peak. And it's like, well, what's the rest of it look like? And I really want to go, find out. And so, yeah, the Cascades are well formed to really stimulate your imagination when you're up there and you get up high.
Oh, I love that. I love that. That was a great description. And it's funny, Lowell, that's exactly how I imagine the North Cascades. It's just how you described it. Just like getting up to a place, looking out and being like, oh, I wonder what's over that next valley, or I wonder what it would like to be up on that peak.
Yeah, a term that has been used in literature is a storm-tossed sea of peaks. So it's a sea of peaks that's like really rugged. They're not just sort of rolling hills. They're these peaks and ridges and ice falls and so on peeking up over the
Right.
horizon. Really dramatic.
We've touched on this just a little bit, but I think I'm going to talk more specifically about the North Cascades. But like, why are the North Cascades important in North American climbing, skiing, and outdoor history?
But the North Cascades for many years have been referred to as the American Alps. And the reason that they were called that is that unlike really any other range in the lower 48, the North Cascades are pretty heavily glaciated. Now, I must say the glaciers are getting kind of hammered by the warming
Right.
climate. But
Right.
traditionally, there are more glaciers in the North Cascades and larger than anywhere else in the country. There are other ranges that have some glaciers, but none to the extent that the North Cascades do. Folks who aren't real familiar with the area, they know about Mount Rainier, they know about Mount Baker, and they probably recognize that those peaks have glaciers on them. You can see them from the distance. But in the North Cascades, and of course, Rainier and Baker are volcanoes. The North Cascades, there are a lot of peaks that are not volcanoes, and it's been described that that's the quintessential or Cascade Peak or North Cascades Peak is not a volcano. It's a big granitic or gneissic peak, and oftentimes cloaked by glaciers. So that's a really to the contiguous United States, it's unique to have that kind of topography. And we have what's been called the American Alps. I think traditionally the word Alp refers to a high above timberline slope that is free of trees. an Alp slope, and the North Cascades has lots of those. So you have this wonderful transition from, these big, deep, big tree forests, ancient forests. You work your way up, and maybe it gets brushy, and then you get to these Alp slopes, and these huge, expansive meadows, maybe with old moraines from the glaciers, and then above that, there'll be the glaciers. And then above that will be ridges and faces going up to rock horns or, dramatic peaks. And so it really is a environment that is very different from just about anywhere else in the United States, the lower 48, that is, in its beauty and its variety.
One of the things that I know about the North Cascades, and it's very similar to the exploration I've done in Alaska, is that it seems like you really have to work for a lot of these approaches. And you kind of just touched on that, like, these lowlands are pretty gnarly. You got to get through there, and then you break out into these beautiful meadows, which I would imagine you've had some amazing camp spots up high in some of those valleys and stuff. But can you talk a little bit about just kind of the approaches and just what those are like?
Yeah. The world of mountaineering, is oftentimes is discussed in terms of alpinism, this idea of a way of life of getting up high into the mountains. Well, in the North Cascades, and I'm not sure if I coined it or someone else, we have subalpinism, which is the stuff down below. So before you can get to the alpinism, you have to work yourself through the subalpinism, and it might involve crossing creeks that don't have a bridge, maybe on a log where you're scooching. I've done this, scooching along on a log with maybe a full pack, maybe even has skis on it, and bushwhacking through Slide Alder and Devil's Club, and working your way up some just decrepit old trail to finally get up to timberline. And so that it really is one of the classic characteristics of mountaineering in the North Cascades. And as a skier, it's even worse.
Oh, yeah.
Because if you're trying to work up through that and you got a pair of skis on your pack, you got just one more thing to get caught. And Slide Alder just loves to grab onto skis and ski poles and whatever it is you have strapped onto your pack. So yeah, there are one of the things you do as a North Cascades climber is you learn, well, what are the good approaches and what are the bad approaches? But occasionally you get stuck with a bad one, maybe if you had to bail out due to weather or something like that. And so, yeah, it's a whole package of remoteness when you add in the struggles of getting up to timberline sometimes.
Right. Do North Cascades climbers and or skiers have a little bit of a sense of pride in that their approaches are tough?
Yeah, yeah, I think so. I think there's sort of this sense that if you can handle the whole package here, you can probably handle it just about anywhere, and which is true. I mean, the Cascades have produced some terrific world-class mountaineers, people like John Roskelley and Steve Swenson, and there's a whole bunch of them. Fred Beckey, of course. The Whitaker twins, and Jim Whitaker did the first American ascent of Mount Everest, and Pete Schoening on K2, and really there's a whole legacy of remarkable people climbing and enjoying the North Cascades.
So, talk about the inspiration for writing Written in Snows. How did that all come together for you?
I was a ski instructor in high school, but got involved in backcountry skiing around the same time I started climbing. And it was generally with my older brother, Gordy, and some friends of his who were a bit older than me. And so this was in the late 70s, during college and just after college. So got involved in climbing and backcountry skiing, in ski touring. And we ended up doing what for the Cascades were pioneering trips, taking skis where they had not been taken before. Things like the Isolation Traverse, which is north of Cascade Pass, the Picket Range Traverse. And I did a link up of trips over many years, all the way from Mount Baker to Mount Rainier, some of them new, some of them established. And yeah, there hadn't been really any written history of that. There was a book published by the American Alpine Club a few years back called Wild Snow, written by Lou Dawson of Colorado. And it's good in some ways, but I didn't think it really covered the North Cascades or the Cascades adequately, and thought, yeah, someone who Lou's a great guy. He's a good friend now, but he lives in Colorado and doesn't live in this area, and so is a little bit secondhand, third hand on the information in his book. So I thought, yeah, somebody should kind of research this, and I started doing that. And in the early days, human-powered skiing, early days being the 1990s, and it's not that early, really, but I actually pitched the book to the Mountaineers Books, which ultimately published it. And they weren't particularly interested because the market was small. The people who were backcountry skiing back then, the gear, a lot of them were telemark skiers. And if you were skiing in alpine touring gear, the gear was pretty primitive and not very easy to do distant travel with. It wasn't very comfortable. So I didn't get interest in publishing back in the early 2000s when I pitched it, but I kept working on it, and over time ended up putting in over 8,000 hours of research into this thing over a period of 20 years. It's kind of nuts. And I actually kept like a spreadsheet, that records all of that. Who did I talk to? How many hours did I spend? How many hours did I spend in the library today? Or going through my notes. Yeah, I think it's like 8,600 hours now, give or take. And actually, it's interesting, the confluence of events. I've already mentioned Fred Beckey, this legendary author and climber in the Northwest. Well, he passed away in, what was it, 2017, 2018, something, a few years ago. And they had a memorial gathering for him at the Mountaineers in Seattle. And I was kind of helping pull together some materials, and I put together a kind of a slideshow of Fred's life set to music, the phases of his life. And there were, I think maybe the editor-in-chief of the Mountaineers Books was part of the committee that put this thing together. And afterwards, she sort of said, you still thinking about that book project? He knew about it. And that was kind of the kickoff, that connection. I think maybe she saw that, hey, he can actually kind of do good work. Because I put together this thing, and I think it was well received. And so that started a conversation. And the actual writing of the book ended up being kind of a COVID pandemic project, which was a great project to have. But yeah, I was kind of heads down working on writing over a period of about a year.
So if you were going to give, just like a real short synopsis of what the book is about, go ahead and describe that.
Yeah, well, of course, it's a regional book. It's about the Northwest, and it's about really kind of the story of human-powered skiing, which means it's actually taking skiing from before there were any chairlifts or gondolas or rope tows even, and taking it up to the present where, sure, lift skiing emerges, becomes a big part of the sport. For many years, it was the big part of the sport. But in more recent years, people have rediscovered human-powered skiing. That was there at the beginning, and it's there now. There were kind of periods when there weren't that many people doing it, but there were also interesting periods where that was also an important part of the sport and of the culture. During World War II, we had what was known as the 10th Mountain Division. A lot of stories have been written about the 10th Mountain Division, and particularly in recent years as most of the veterans are passing away. So that becomes then a part of the story I told, is the 10th Mountain Division during World War II was set up to try to make sure that American forces had soldiers that could operate in the mountains in winter, in any weather, in any place. And part of that included winter mountaineering, and so they had the guys out on skis. They didn't do much skiing in terms of when they actually got into the war in Italy. But there were some patrols where people were out doing skiing and so on. They've been giving all the training. And the thing that was most important really was the fact they were trained to function in cold weather and in rugged terrain and to operate that way. So these are all parts of this bigger story of this kind of arc of skiing and how it relates to our history and some of the people involved and some of the great stories that have come out of it.
Very cool. Talk about who are some of the most important characters that you talk about in the book?
Yeah, important people that I talk about. Oh, there's kind of a galaxy of people. Some of the early folks. One fellow who I guess one of the things that was most rewarding was I did get into my research early enough to talk to people in person, and interview them who had been active since the 1930s, since before World War II. People, in some cases, even older than my parents. One of those was Wolf Bauer, who was remarkable. He was an immigrant from Germany, and he was an expert in climbing, in skiing, in kayaking, and in conservation. And he was kind of a pioneer in all of those things. Another person was a guy named John Woodward, who was in the 10th Mountain Division and was one of the earliest officers in the 10th Mountain Division. He was also a champion ski racer before the war. Those are just two examples of really interesting people who were actually older than my own parents, who I had a chance to, you talk to someone in person, you kind of reach back, through their stories to having the first person sense of what it was like in those days. There was a whole galaxy of other people that, some of my only knew about through writings, through newspaper articles, through stories, and so on. Another couple of guys that are particularly, this photographers, Bob and Ira Spring, were twins, a little bit older than my parents. And I never talked to Bob, but I did talk to Ira. And they had all of these wonderful photographs from the 40s and 50s and 60s that to me were that was, during my, I was born in mid 50s, and during the 60s, the pictures I saw of our local mountains were more often than not by Bob and Ira Spring. And so to be able to get to know Ira, and ultimately after he passed away, his son kind of gave me free rein to go through his black and white collection. So if you go into my book, there are more Bob and Ira Spring photos than any others because they're great pictures, and I had, excellent access to it. There was also a fellow named Tom Miller, who was a climber and had written a book, a real kind of seminal book on the North Cascades. It's called The North Cascades. It was published in the late 50s at a time when the North Cascades weren't protected as a park. There was no North Cascades Park. There wasn't even a Glacier Peak Wilderness yet at that time. And they published this book, the Mountaineers published a book to kind of raise awareness to the amazing mountains we have up there. And I got to know him pretty well, and his son as well. I did a trip or two with his son. So yeah, these people, again, it's this reaching back through a personal conversation with somebody. That's been some of the most rewarding times in this work.
Very cool. It sounds like, although this book has been obviously like a massive labor, work-wise for you, I get the sense that this has been very personally rewarding for you as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was, yeah, meeting these people, and in some cases, having access to their works. In the case of Tom Miller, looking at his pictures, Bob and Ira Spring, there was another couple of folks, Chuck and Marion Hesse. They're from the east side of the Cascades. They had a bunch of movies. And so I've worked with a lot of movies, and these movies are just wonderful where a picture is worth 1,000 words. The movies take that picture and puts it in motion. And sometimes in the case of the Hesse films, for example, you've got Chuck Hesse's voice describing what they're seeing and what they're doing. So, though I never met him, I did meet his wife, Marion. It's this reaching back that is a really rewarding experience.
I've been having, as I told you earlier today, I've been doing a lot of interviews, way more than I normally do for these stories that I'm wanting to tell. But I've been, this season of the Firn line, I'm basically, the theme of it is kind of unlocking the history of some of North America's most iconic mountains and routes. And so, I'm talking to a lot of kind of old timers, people who did these first ascents all the way up to modern climbers who are doing, new routes and stuff. So it's been really cool. But one of the themes that has been coming up a lot is just talking about the difference in technology. Like when you talk about adventure in some of these places back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, even into the 90s, compared to like the technology that you have now. For example, all these climbers now, they've got these GPSs and stuff, which, back in the day when I was doing big glacier traverses in Alaska, we had USGS topographic maps and compasses.
Oh yeah.
I kind of am curious to get your perspective on what do you just think when you think about how technology is advanced? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's so many facets for it. As you mentioned, kind of information technology, including navigation. Just being able to pull up a cell phone and hit a button and have the map snap to a place on the topo map. I mean, 99% of route finding is knowing where you
Right.
are,
Right.
and so that's huge. So it could be, especially in the Cascades, total fog out. You can't see a thing, but you hit this thing and suddenly you know where you are. And that was not possible. You can imagine being out there with a paper map and it's a whiteout and you're above tree line. It's like, well, where the heck are we? So that's one thing. There's so much information available because of online communication, and online forums and so on. And you can capture not just timeless information about a mountain or something, but what was the conditions there yesterday, is kind of remarkable, to have that much information. Or say you've got a trip planned and you want to know, maybe it's a ski trip, you want to know what are the snow conditions like. Well, now you can find sites that have satellite imagery, just a few days old, that show you what the snow cover is, or you can get reports from various sources that way. So that's been, it's a real revolution in knowledge. Another thing too that should not be discounted is just the gear we have. It's being able to lighten your load is really huge. If you imagine the guys with flannel sleeping bags and canvas packs and heavy pitons and big heavy wooden ice axes and crampons that weigh a pound apiece, and compare it to the sort of gear that we have now, you can start to, and then of course people know how to train better, and maybe now you can be an influencer and be paid to basically do some of this stuff. It's a whole different world, and so I think recording history is valuable in many ways, but one of the ways is for us to kind of appreciate how good we got it, or in the case of, say, climate change, how worrying we should be, but also just, what took to do that in the old days. You get a much deeper appreciation when you can remember or experience that. That's kind of one of the things that's cool about volunteer as a archivist for the Mountaineers, and we've got a fair amount of artifacts, and so you get some of these old artifacts of ice axes and crampons and packs and sleeping bags and so on, and start playing with them, and you realize just how primitive it was, in your parents' generation when they were doing these things.
No doubt. Yeah, I was the first episode or story that I'm telling for the Firn line this season is about the history of the Emperor face on Mount Robson. And so, we've been talking about the first ascent of that, I think, was back in 1979. And so we're talking about the gear they were using. I mean, and it was probably, and they ended up doing some of the hardest mix climbing that had ever been done at the time. And you think about, straight shafted bamboo ice axes. I mean, and back in the 70s, I mean, that was back in a time when, we didn't have bolts like that. You don't fall on lead back then, or you hope to not fall.
I have straight shafted bamboo ice axes.
Yeah.
Yes, and I used them.
Well, it sounds like obviously you have a real appreciation for history, but it also sounds like you appreciate, man, the way that technology has advanced climbing is pretty darn cool. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's amazing. You hear stories of people, for example, doing through hikes or something of a trip in the North Cascades that would normally take a couple weeks, and they're doing it in 3 days, or something like that, with trail running equipment and training and super light packs and who knows what all they're doing. But yeah, in a way, it makes the mountains smaller, but they're still just as beautiful. Yeah, it's really pretty amazing.
Okay, so the last question, kind of about the book. To talk about who is this book for? Like, who's the audience that you think this book is for, and what is your hope for what someone might take away from reading the book?
Yeah, well, of course, it's kind of aimed at skiers, and that thankfully is a much bigger demographic than it was when I first started working on it. So there's a fair amount of appreciation for it in that group, but it doesn't have to just be skiers. Anyone who appreciates the Northwest and the beautiful resources we have here, and some of the unique characteristics of that resource, that is reflected in the stories. And so, yeah, I think having an appreciation for this place that we live in and the people who have shaped its story, that's kind of what the book is about. And so it really is kind of a celebration of place, you might say, place and community. So I hope that people just come away from that reading it with a much richer appreciation for this community we live in and this place that we live in.
All right, well, thanks for hanging out with me today. I hope you got as much out of Lowell's stories as I did, and make sure and check out his book, Written in the Snows, which you can find online at The Mountaineers, Amazon, or any place good books are sold. If you enjoy the Firn Line, please consider becoming a subscriber over on Patreon. Leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts, or tell a friend. And remember, the Firn Line is now on YouTube, where you can find full episodes, as well as a fine selection of bonus content as well. Finally, a big thanks to our sponsors, the Hoarding Marmot and the Alaska Rock Gym. All right, well, take care of yourselves. Peace out. We will catch you next time on the Firn Line.